What is going on, everybody? It's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and today I'm going to talk about the Auribus Acoustics Sierra. Now the Sierra at $1,200 obviously isn't cheap, and that price is going to put it in a lot of competition with other big brands and some other boutique brands I've reviewed in the past, and I'll be making mention and covering some of the other models later in this review when I talk about some sound quality and coverage stuff. This video was filmed before Axpona. If you're watching this video before Axpona, which is a huge audio show in Chicago, I will have a link in the description for that. These will be on display at the Mimic Audio booth, so if you happen to be attending that show, I strongly suggest checking them out because a lot of this stuff is subjective. I can tell you my own opinion and how I hear things, but your personal preferences may be different, as well as your hearing, your head shape, etc. All of those are factored in, so if you can somehow get your hands on one of these to try out, I strongly recommend doing that. Having said all that, I want to talk about what's included because it's relatively straightforward. You get a zip-up travel case. It's kind of like a hard case, but it has some physical protection to it, but it's not a briefcase style one like some of the higher-end Audio-Technicas or Meze Audios. So you have a little foam inlay here that has a cutout to help kind of nestle the ear cups in. A little pouch that the cable comes in. It has a wire clip to attach the cable to your shirt. I never really had any microphonics issues with this, and even though it's an open back and all that good stuff, no issues whatsoever on the cable, which I want to talk about. The cable it comes with isn't bad. It kind of reminds me of an IEM cable. No real issues with it, no microphonics problems. Even has a choke like an IEM cable. And it's terminated in 3.5 millimeter with a 1/4 inch adapter that looks a little bit different. It's kind of shiny and slippery and a little more compact. I prefer the traditional grippy kind, but they're cheap. You can obviously switch it out with your own. For getting a headphone like this, you probably already have a few 1/4 inch adapters. On the other end, you have a TRS sleeved dual 3.5 millimeter, which is great because the world is your oyster for buying aftermarket cables. It's a very common connection, and you can use something like the Meze Audio boom mic. So if you want to use this for gaming or chat during the day, you can easily switch that cable. Now this video wasn't sponsored by Dakoni, but I do have a discount code now that I'm really happy to share with everyone. It gets you 10% off anything on their store. You don't have to buy a specific cable or use a special link. I'll have a link in the description below to shop Dakoni. But the only reason why I wanted to bring them up is because they have something called the Ensemble cable. I talked about this in a holiday audio guide in the past, but the reason why I wanted to show you this is you can see the multiple rings on the cable that's included with the Sierra. Well, even if you buy a TS sleeved cable instead of the TRS, a TS sleeved cable will still work on this. So you can get a dual 3.5. Something like this is cool because you have the connection going to the headphone and then this termination on the end, allowing you to have multiple pigtails hooked up to all of your headphones because they have Sennheiser, they have Mini XLR, obviously the 3.5, and it just makes life super easy to swap. So if you want to customize your audio solution, they have it in this blue and then this silver braid. I hope they come out with more colors down the road personally, but there's a couple good options out there. So I want to talk about build quality, comfort, and ergonomics first, because these are wildly different. And I brought out a couple of boutique headphones that I think a lot of people are going to be asking about in comparison to this. So obviously this video is going to be about the Sierra primarily, but I did want to talk about the Hi-Fi for All Dahlia and the DMS Omega, which is on its final pre-order run, final batch before that's no longer being sold, and talk about some pros and cons of both to kind of put it in perspective. So starting with the Sierra, this uses an SLS-printed chassis. It is a 3D printed technology. It's not like your everyday stuff that you would typically have at your home. Aircraft grade aluminum, you can see the vents, you can see the silk screens. Now my version of the Sierra has an oval shaped gasket for the pad. These are round pads. You can see the nightmare that I dealt with when I popped this off by accident because putting it back on was ridiculous. I am pretty good at doing a lot of pad swaps, and this one was a little bit challenging, but I am pleased to say that the new batch of the Sierra is switching to a round cup design, and once they're on, they are relatively stable. These are obviously very large pads too, they're quite deep, and they use a Dakoni Elite hybrid pad, so it's a good quality pad, very comfortable. Now the chassis is a different design as well. It kind of looks like the Sennheiser HD 800S top part, and you can see this piece is kind of flexible. This doesn't feel as secure. It's not like it's bad or any way, but this is the part, I think the most DIY looking part is this particular design. I have seen mainstream brands have, quite different approaches on this, but what's cool about this is you can size this to get quite large. This is a clampy headphone, but if you expand this, it can fit huge heads, and like to a point where this is not even close to fitting my head. And you can see the gap when I lift it up here. That's not even on the largest possible setting. The one issue I have is you can tell the adjustment mechanism, it's a little sticky. It doesn't feel like as fluid as what you'd get from a higher end headphone in this price range from some of the mainstream brands. You know, the Focal have a very consistent clicky headband. Hi-Fi Man is just a leather strap that slides up and down. It's relatively simple, but when you start looking at some of the, like the Audio Technica stuff, Meze Audio, their ergonomics of products like that are quite incredible. This is still adjustable and I can still dial it in, it just doesn't feel as fluid. Now you have really good adjustment mechanisms because you can see the cup rotates and pivots, a lot of pivot. In fact, it goes all the way around. And it's balanced well and there's enough resistance where it's not like floppy. And I say that because the DMS headphone, it kind of flops everywhere. I talked about this in my review. That was my biggest gripe with this headphone, is the ergonomics, not comfort, but the way the chassis handling is. It's such a floppy headphone, and I think it got a little bit better in later revisions, but you can tell it doesn't even want to kind of sit straight on it. So I like the adjustment mechanisms on this. It feels great. The only thing I want to point out, and I think this is being addressed as well because I provided feedback, but if it doesn't, you can see how easy it is to rotate. As soon as you put outward pressure, you can't really rotate it. It's very grippy, and I can't like simulate this. You can see how it kind of falls. Mine's broken in a bit, but if there is tension, it really, like, I can actually put weight on it before it wants to rotate. The reason why I say that is if I kick this out and then put it on, you can see it doesn't cup inward. It doesn't like come back into place. Like, look at this. I can like really push and I still don't have a seal. So as soon as I relax the headband, it'll be easier, but you really have to nestle this in. This also has the strongest clamp force of the three by quite a bit. In fact, about 50% more clamp force, maybe even more out of the box. And that takes a little bit of breaking in. It did soften up just slightly for me, but not by much. And I know you can modify this band. Because this isn't my unit, I'm sending it back. I have no kickbacks for this review. It was sent to me. Huge thanks to Auribus Acoustics, but I didn't want to modify the chassis. I'm just going to explain how it comes out of the box. So when you have high clamp force and something that doesn't like to automatically adjust or conform to your head, it's kind of a recipe for long-term comfort issues if you don't caress it into place. Once you do that, because these are large and comfortable pads, you can see I'm kind of just, you know, playing with this a little bit to dial it in. Once you do that, it is very comfortable. It's a little bit clampy compared to the others. That's the only real gripe. Now the Hi-Fi for All Dahlia is a completely different chassis experience. So you have a more traditional single, I shouldn't say more traditional, this kind of reminds me more of like the Meze Audio style telescoping yoke system. It's like a glide, it's a smooth glide. This is better suited for medium to larger heads. On the smallest setting, it just fits me. And I like their ergonomics as well because you have some pivot and rotate. And because the rotation's so soft, you can see I can literally just let go of it and it fits my head. It's the loosest one, so if I'm not wearing a hat and you lean down, you look up, it feels a little looser on your head, whereas the Sierra is very secure. And the Omega is quite secure as well. The Omega kind of falls in the middle as far as clamp force goes, but it's much closer to the Dahlia than it is the Sierra. I should have taken this cable off. I was using that to keep these things in check on that stand. This is very easy to dial in as well. You feel the hot spot right here for this particular headband design. It definitely puts more pressure on the center of your head, where both of these are more spread out. All right, so we need to get into sound quality, and I want to start with the objective side first that takes my opinion out of it. And I use a Gross KB006X Pinaclone with an IC711 coupler clone. That's what all my measurements are based out of. I take multiple seatings and then I average it, and that's my testing methodology. So if you're comparing my measurements to someone else's, just keep that in mind. It's not always going to match up. They have different rigs, simulators, and test methodology. However, I've measured a ton of headphones and gaming headsets on my particular Squiglink. Link in the description below for that if you want to compare how this measures to others. Now, having said all that, take a look at how this measures. It's ridiculous. And frankly, it's one of the best measuring headphones, period. Never mind the price, never mind who makes it. On my particular graph, it measures exceptionally well. It's almost like the Sierra didn't get the memo that this is an open back headphone because the sub bass is insane. Now, funny enough, this uses the same peerless driver as both the Hi-Fi for All Dahlia and the DMS Omega. Not a super expensive driver, but drivers are only one piece of a much more expensive puzzle from designing and testing, marketing and production and all that good stuff. However, what makes the Sierra different is it uses an electrical filter that affects how the driver behaves. And this filter is adjusting the tuning overall, but it really affects the sub bass and the treble delivery of the Sierra. It also affects efficiency. So just to show you the impedance plot of this is the electrical impedance of the Sierra. Quite low, dipping to 10 ohms or lower at the high end, and the peak isn't even that high. The nominal impedance is closer to 20 ohms, and when you compare it to the Dahlia and the Omega, which is a bit higher, they react differently based off your output impedance. So because of that, you'll have more of a bass shelf lift when you're using something like the Omega or the Dahlia, where it won't be as affected or effective on the Sierra. I say all this because this electrical filter does come at a cost of efficiency. The Sierra is much more difficult to drive than these two, and in fact many other headphones, more so than almost every headphone I have. I think even the Sasvara is going to give it a run for the money. I haven't personally measured or tried a Modhouse Tungsten in my studio, but from what I've heard about being easy to drive, that's kind of like as hard as it gets. This is quite up there. It is a relatively efficient driver, so the power it does get, it does convert into sound quite easily, but that electric filter is what's taking a lot of that away. So now that you understand the filter is adjusting the sound, this is the byproduct of that. So if you do have the amp overhead, if you have something with a little bit more juice, preferably a few hundred milliwatts at 32 ohms would be ideal, you can benefit greatly. Now, measurements aren't everything. I will talk about more comparisons after, but when you look at the DMS Project Omega, you can see more sub-bass roll-off. You look at the Dahlia, which again has a similar sub-bass roll-off, and all three of these have excellent mid-range properties, by the way. I can't show every measurement here, but when you compare it to some other products from Meze, Hi-Fi Man, Focal, etc., these are pretty amazing in the mid-range. They differ the most, aside from sub-bass on the Sierra, they differ the most in the low treble to high treble. I'm not going to use the measurements too much to explain all of the sound, but the biggest takeaway here is you have really good sub-bass extension on the Sierra, and if I turn a couple of these off, there's no really strong emphasis or peak anywhere in the mid-range, which is going to produce very natural sounding tonality and timbre. There's no huge recesses, so things aren't going to sound too veiled or lacking. And the upper treble is certainly present enough where you still have some sense of space, but it's not going to be overly bright or metallic sounding, sparkly, fatiguing, etc. This is a really nice subdued, bass warm presentation. Of course, what really matters at the end of the day is how we all hear it. And I say we because I might hear something differently than you, and we also have different preferences, different genres, etc. What makes this Sierra special, as long as you know the caveats of the slightly stronger clamp force and needing a little bit more amp power, is this type of tuning is safe, but also still rewarding. The sub bass is very strong. It's not so strong that it's dominating the rest of the mix. The vocals sound supernatural. I find myself when I listen to the Sierra, I'm never distracted on questioning if a mid-range presentation such as an instrument or a voice sounds the way that does in real life. It sounds very true to being a natural sound without any weird coloration. Now the treble presentation is going to vary a lot from listener to listener because we have different levels of listening health, frequency roll-off, how it interacts with our pinna, etc. This headphone, starting with the bass, is rather deep and it's rather punchy, but I will explain the caveat of this is still the same driver as the Dahlia and the Omega, and without EQ you're getting that punchy bass, but there is only so much the Peerless driver can put out for SPL at certain frequencies. And because of that, if you listen to a headphone at very high volumes, which I don't recommend, but I know some people do, when it's being pushed like this, that bass comes at a cost of a little bit or losing some of the micro details in the mid-range. I find that you can hear and this happens with both of these as well, especially if you boost the bass a little bit and start turning the volume up. It's not exclusive to the Sierra. The issue is the Sierra is starting with a higher bass shelf, so that slight distortion or lack of clarity in the mid-range comes at a sooner and lower SPL level than these do. If you EQ the bass down to compensate, then you're going to have a similar power handling. So I found that the only time it was distracting is if there's a really bass-heavy song and you're turning it up a little bit, depending on the dynamic range of the song. That was the only time I had an issue with some of the presentation. I think overall though, the way it's tuned, and how natural it sounds in the mid-range, more people are going to like this headphone than like 95% of the headphones on the market, because it doesn't have any obvious flaws in terms of overall presentation. The upper, mid-range, and low treble isn't overly bright. It's not as like exciting or resolving sounding, but what happens is, because this, a lot of people have kind of dubbed this the Sennheiser HD600 with sub bass. Well, the Sennheiser HD600 sounds the way it does because it doesn't have a lot of sub bass. So by adding sub bass, you are shifting the overall music presentation a little bit. As a result, this doesn't sound as clinical or analytical than these two. The Dahlia of the three is the most analytical and detailed presentation, partly because it's also the brightest of the three. It's not like punishingly bright. I like the mid-range just slightly more on the Dahlia, at least the low mid-range, compared to the Omega, because the Omega has a little bit of a lift around 1 kilohertz that adds a very subtle, pinchy quality to the vocals. It's really minor, and then part of that is a byproduct of the pad, because even though I prefer the suede pads on the Dahlia from ZMF, that brought that same pinchy characteristic that the Omega had. I liked that overall a little bit more, but I just wanted to point that out. However, going back to the way the Sierra sounds on the whole mid-range and treble thing, this is more analytical, but what I find is the whole talk about the Sierra being like an HD600 with sub bass, well, it centers the vocals a little bit closer to the HD600. These two, the vocals are a little bit wider presented than the Sennheiser lineup. And what happens is, when you get higher frequency instruments or different musical notes that are outside of that center mid-range area, that's where the soundstage opens up on the Sierra. It's kind of fun because it's not constantly throwing different audio cues at a high width at you, which can create almost an overwhelming sensation, some form of fatigue if you have something that's just too wide sounding. So I like that this kind of tiptoes and balances the whole idea of intimacy and sub bass while still having some good musicality and fun to the presentation. Now conversely, when you go to the Dahlia is the most exciting sounding of the three. And I'm not saying this in a negative way, because I was very positive of the Dahlia when I reviewed it. I love the way this opens up music, because some stuff that might sound a little bit boring, it's really, really fun for like symphony orchestra music. A lot of guitar music. The only downside with the Dahlia is it can be just a little bit too bright for some people, because there's no real area that it's like scooped to make it sound relaxed. But it's also not as bright as something like the Hi-Fi Man Aria Stealth or Organic, which have an even more excited sound presentation. I guess if I had to summarize the Dahlia a little bit better, is it has like a little bit more cleaner analytical presentation, whereas this one sounds just slightly more relaxed, a little bit more full-bodied, partly because of that sub bass and then the slightly relaxed treble that goes with it. The Omega has a good balance of both. I've been very positive with the Omega as well. I think the only real issue I've had is that slight pinchiness that I get around 1K, but overall it doesn't have the same amount of brightness or analytical chops I think that the Dahlia has, and it also doesn't have the same body and heft that the Sierra has, thanks to that insane sub bass. So if you are listening to like a lot of EDM and rap, or if you're anything that's demanding sub bass, or if you watch a lot of movies, that's where the Sierra really shines. And I'm not listening to music at such a high volume where that distortion issue becomes a major problem for me, but there's no getting around how immersive that sub bass is. I might mispronounce this, but there's a song called Yulunga, which in parentheses it says Spirit Dance, and it's by a group called Dead Can Dance. That is a long song that exposes a lot of issues with headphones. I don't always listen to it specifically because it's one of my favorite songs. It is a fun listen to on really good equipment, but if a headphone is shouty or a speaker is shouty, overly bright, lacks any bass, lacks dynamics, this song really shows a lot of different things as you listen to it. And it's a longer track. It takes several minutes to build up. That's the type of song that showcases how good the Sierra is. I was really happy with the bass presentation, and the vocals in that song are borderline harsh the way it comes across if you listen to it at higher volumes. So a more relaxed vocal presentation is going to benefit on a song like that. It comes across slightly shouty on the Omega, even though it's not a shouty headphone. The way it's presented, just the voices have a little bit more bite to it. And then on the Dahlia, it's you do have this brightness, but because you don't have the same depth of bass, the brightness and clarity come across much more forward in the mix, and there's more bite and attack to it as a result. Again, none of these are necessarily flaws. It's just how different three headphones that look somewhat similar in mid-range can sound on the same song. It's quite shocking, and I see why a lot of people like the Sierra, because on certain tracks it just seems to work a little bit easier and safer depending on the mix. When it comes to gaming, obviously it's going to vary quite a bit, not only with personal preference but what you play, and the Sierra having that really strong sub bass is going to do wonders for immersive gaming, casual gaming. So if you have thunderstorms, you have explosions, that sub bass is no joke. I mean, we're talking like 5 to 10 decibels of extra bass depending on what frequency it's coming at, and that's quite obvious when you play different games. So the relaxed mid-range is nice because it's not fatiguing, but it still stages really wide, so it doesn't sound too congested even with all that extra bass. So it's a really nice tuning profile for a wide variety of gaming. Without doing any EQ or mods or anything like that, the DMS Omega was my favorite when it came to competitive play. It's just that little extra 1K lift, which can negatively color some songs, but that 1K lift actually helps me in competitive play, kind of boost the footstep frequencies a little bit more, and those stand out, followed by the relaxed 4K presentation of the Omega compared to the rest of the treble. So as a result, it just has a really good natural sounding presentation for competitive play where I don't need too much bass. The Dahlia is a little bit more bright, and with EQ I loved it, especially because it's so comfortable. It doesn't have that same pressure point at the top of the head. But when I swapped this with the ZMF suede pads from my Caldera, that's where it became my favorite, because that then more closely mimicked how the Omega sounded with that lift at 1K, while also reducing some of the low and mid treble to compensate as well. The other thing to keep in mind is if you are getting this for console play, don't forget the Sierra needs quite a bit of juice to get played at a higher volume. So depending on what you're playing or listening to, something like a game controller or a lower power DAC that you typically get on a console, it may not work well with the Sierra, whereas both the Dahlia and the Omega, being much more efficient, give you a lot more flexibility for your sources. Now, on the note of sources, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because that can be a whole nother discussion, but just because this is more difficult to drive doesn't mean you need a super powerful amp to enjoy it. This is the Questyle M18i, which I will be reviewing. It's not a super powerful dongle DAC, if you will, but it still gets more than loud enough for me to enjoy the Sierra, especially in balanced mode, which is very easy to add if you get a balanced cable for this. So this works fine. I didn't find any benefit like when I went to my more powerful tube amps. I don't think this is going to sound excellent on a tube amp. It already has like really strong sounding bass, so I think a more analytical, clinical sounding amp DAC, something that's using a brighter presentation, will still do just fine. You don't need to add all that warm gooiness to kind of tame it, for example. So I was really happy with Delta Sigma DACs. I used the FIO K11 and the K17 and this little DAP to do a lot of the testing, and then my RME 24 Pro SE, which is pretty much neutral. It works with everything. So really happy with sources. I just know it benefits from a little bit more volume depending on what you're listening to, especially with like classical music with a high dynamic range. Now, I always get asked questions of how this compares to X headphone, and I'll do my best to answer the comments in the description below. The Meze 109 Pro trades a lot of tonality for a funner, more musical sound. It's a nice punchy warm bass, but the vocals are recessed, followed by a more sparkly high in comparison to the Sierra, which is much more neutral sounding. May not sound as magical or sparkly or anything, but I think it's a safer listen than the 109 Pro. The 109 Pro has the edge in, to me, looks and also build quality and comfort. This is the sleeper hit. This is the HD 550 from Sennheiser that I reviewed recently and love. It's $300, and if you look at the frequency response, the mid-range is shockingly similar to the Sierra. It has noticeably less sub bass, and the relaxed low treble area just makes it a little bit more of an easy listen to. It may not sound as resolving as the Sierra, but if you like a lot of what I've said about the Sierra and you're okay with trading off some of the sub bass to still get really good mid-range presentation, at $300, the HD 550 is certainly a worthy listen. Now, I've always liked the Hyphaman Aria Organic, and with price cuts under $1,000, it's pretty absurd, especially because you can EQ the crap out of it, especially if you like a lot of bass. I will say that the upper treble is noticeably brighter. This has a thinner sounding presentation because it's not bass boosted as much as the Sierra. It is still easier to dry, but it has a more metallic-y, plucky sound to it. So it can be off-putting for some people, but it is still highly resolving. So if you listen to higher volumes, you like doing EQ, and you want it to remain crystal clear, the Aria Organic has the ability for micro detail, very technical detail regardless of volume, and even if you get a little bit aggressive with a bass shell, at the sacrifice of some tonality and being a little bit overly bright. Then you have the Audio-Technica ADX 3000, which is very much not for a lot of people. I'm not going to shy away from this. It has a really strong peak at 4K, which adds noticeable coloration to a lot of vocals, and this is not well suited for larger heads. You can see the way this designed. This buckle will touch moderately large heads, not like huge heads, but it will be uncomfortable for some people, and because of that, the way this pivots, it hits the buckle. Having said that, I was very vocal about how much I enjoyed the ADX 3000 because from a technicality standpoint and resolution, this is one of the most resolving dynamic headphones I've ever heard, period. And it's amazing with a tube amp. If you're chasing something that is colored and isn't referenced, it's very light, a little bit clampy, but it's a really fun, unique presentation. If you can ever get your hands on one to try, it's so different, it might still be a fun listen to consider. Now, I made all of these comparisons not to say that any particular one is better or worse than the Sierra. They're all just different. But what makes the Sierra special is it kind of has an identity crisis because it has the sub bass that almost all open backs don't have. And it's not doing it in such an extreme way that's negatively affecting other things. That's the magic with the Sierra, is you're getting a little bit more stage than the HD6XO lineup. You're getting more sub bass than the Sennheisers and many other headphones here. Again, provided you're playing it at a decent volume, not overly pushing it to the limit. It's a good balance, and I think when you start considering the safe volume a lot of people listen to, I can see why a lot of people like it. My only personal gripes with it really come down to ergonomics. I wish it was a little bit more adaptable to my head shape without having to play with it. And the clamp force is a little bit tighter than my personal preference because I don't like it when a headphone puts pressure here. It causes long-term comfort issues for me personally, but it's not bad. I think the pads being as soft as they are really help offset that. So the Sierra met with a lot of enjoyment and positive remarks by both customers and reviewers for a good reason. I can see why a lot of people like it. Hopefully after watching this, if you've been on the fence or didn't know about it, you know more about the Sierra. I know it's not for everybody, both in terms of price and, you know, being a newer brand, but it's definitely something worth being on your radar. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching this and making it to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Love to see you at the next video. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.